Warsaw, 1941. The city that once pulsed with life now breathed under the iron grip of the Third Reich. But here's what the Nazi occupiers never understood about old European cities. Beneath their polished boots, above their arrogant parades, existed an entire world they couldn't see. The rooftops, the chimneys, the forgotten spaces between buildings where a thin man with soot-covered hands could move like a ghost. This is the story of Jakob Mendel, a 34-year-old chimney sweep who became the most unlikely weapons smuggler in occupied Poland. For 2 full years, while German officers slept in requisitioned mansions, while Gestapo agents interrogated suspects in basement cells, Jakob crawled through their chimneys, carrying dismantled rifles, grenades, and ammunition. He moved weapons right over their heads, through their very homes, and they never suspected a thing. The question that should haunt every military strategist is simple. How does a single man, armed with nothing but a brush and rope, outsmart an entire occupying army for 730 days? Before the war turned Warsaw into a prison, Jakob Mendel was nobody special. He inherited his father's chimney sweeping business in 1936, a trade as old as the city itself. He was the man you called when winter came and your stove wouldn't draw properly, when smoke filled your apartment instead of rising into the sky. Warsaw's wealthy families knew him as the polite worker who arrived at dawn, completed his job without fuss, and disappeared up the next chimney by afternoon. His frame was perfect for the work, 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds, all lean muscle and flexible joints. The Great War had taught him to move silently, to control his breathing in tight spaces, to remain calm when every instinct screamed panic. Those skills, learned in the muddy trenches of 1917, would transform him into something the resistance desperately needed, but didn't know existed. A human supply line that could operate in 3 dimensions, while the Germans only watched 2. The occupation changed everything with brutal efficiency. By October 1940, the Nazis had divided Warsaw into sectors, implemented curfews, and begun the systematic dismantling of Polish society. Jewish families were forced into the ghetto. Intellectuals disappeared in the night. Anyone caught with a weapon faced immediate execution, often in public squares as a warning to others. The Polish resistance, scattered and desperate, faced an impossible logistics problem. How do you move weapons through a city where every street corner has a checkpoint, where collaborators watch from every window, where German patrols can stop and search anyone at any moment? The underground fighters had courage and conviction, but courage doesn't fire bullets. They needed guns, ammunition, explosives. They needed a supply chain. And every conventional route, every obvious path led straight to a firing squad. This was the Warsaw that Jakob navigated every morning, climbing onto rooftops before the sun rose, his brushes and ropes marking him as harmless. The Germans saw servants, not threats. A chimney sweep was part of the urban landscape, as invisible as the pigeons on the ledges. What they failed to understand was the access this profession provided. In a city of 800,000 people, chimneys connected everything. The mansion where a German colonel slept backed up against the apartment building where resistance members hid weapons. The headquarters of the Gestapo shared a courtyard with civilian housing. The ventilation systems of Nazi administrative buildings opened onto the same roof networks that Jakob had known since childhood. He could enter a building on one street and emerge 4 blocks away, all without ever touching the ground. And in occupied Warsaw, the ability to move unseen wasn't just valuable, it was priceless. The transformation from tradesman to smuggler began with a conversation Jakob never wanted to have. Piotr Kowalski, a former teacher turned resistance leader, approached him in February 1941 with a proposal that sounded like a suicide mission. The resistance had acquired 50 rifles from a sympathetic Wehrmacht deserter, but the weapons were in the industrial district and needed to reach fighters in 3 different safe houses across the city. Every courier they sent through the streets got stopped, searched, or followed. They needed someone who could move above the city, someone the Germans wouldn't question even if they saw him. Piotr had watched Jakob work for weeks, studying his routes, timing his movements. He knew something the Gestapo didn't. The rooftops of Warsaw formed a highway, and Jakob Mendel knew every inch of it. The proposal was simple and terrifying. Would Jakob use his profession as cover to move weapons through the one network the Nazis never thought to guard? Jakob's first instinct was refusal. He had a wife, Elżbieta, and a 7-year-old daughter, Anna. Getting caught meant death, not just for him but potentially for them. The Nazis had made their policy clear. The family of saboteurs shared the saboteurs' fate. But Piotr showed him something that changed the equation. Photographs. Jewish children being marched into the ghetto. Polish professors hanging from lampposts. The burned remains of the library where Jakob had learned to read. This wasn't just occupation. It was erasure. And in that moment, Jakob understood a truth that would define the next 2 years of his life. Silence was also a choice, and that choice had consequences too. He looked at Piotr and asked just one question: when do we start? The answer came immediately. Tomorrow morning, before dawn, when the city still sleeps and the chimneys need cleaning. The war above the war was about to begin. The mechanics of Jakob's new double life required precision that would make a watchmaker nervous. Every morning at 4:30, he left his small apartment in the Praga district, carrying the same equipment he'd carried for 15 years. Brushes with wire bristles, hemp ropes, canvas bags for collecting soot, and a leather tool belt worn smooth by decades of use. The Germans had registered him as an essential worker, which meant he had movement papers that allowed him to cross district boundaries during curfew hours. Chimneys didn't care about occupation politics. They still needed cleaning, and the Nazi officers who'd requisitioned Warsaw's finest homes demanded the same services the previous owners had enjoyed. This gave Jakob something precious: legitimate access. He could knock on any door in the city, show his papers, and be welcomed inside to do a job that required him to disappear into walls and emerge on rooftops. The occupiers had handed him the perfect cover without realizing they'd armed their own smuggling operation. The first weapons transfer happened on February 23, 1941, and Jakob's hands shook so badly he almost dropped a dismantled pistol down an actual chimney. Piotr had arranged for him to clean the flue system of a townhouse in the Śródmieście district, a building the resistance had been using as a temporary weapons cache. The German patrol schedule showed a 15-minute gap between rounds in that sector, just enough time for Jakob to climb onto the roof, cross 2 buildings via a maintenance walkway only he knew existed, and descend into a safe house chimney on the adjacent street. He carried the disassembled Vis pistol in 3 pieces, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into his soot collection bag. If anyone looked, they'd see compressed ash and creosote residue. The climb was routine, something he'd done 1,000 times. But this time, his heart hammered against his ribs like it wanted to escape his chest. Every sound seemed amplified: the scrape of his boots on tile, the creak of the rope, the distant bark of German commands 3 streets away. He reached the safe house chimney, lowered the package down on a rope to waiting hands below, and climbed back across to complete his original job. Total time elapsed 11 minutes. When he emerged from the first townhouse, soot-covered and exhausted, the German patrol was just rounding the corner. One officer nodded at him with bored recognition. Just the chimney sweep, nothing to see. That first success established the pattern that would define the next 730 days. Jakob became a human supply line operating in the dimension the Germans forgot to control: vertical space. Warsaw's architecture worked in his favor in ways the Nazi occupiers never considered. The city had been built over centuries, with buildings added, modified, and connected in organic ways that defied logical mapping. Chimneys from different eras often shared flue systems. Rooftops connected through maintenance passages built for workers who no longer existed. Attic spaces bridged buildings that appeared separate from street level. Jakob had spent 2 decades learning this hidden infrastructure, memorizing which roofs could bear weight, which chimneys had false backs installed by previous generations of workers, which buildings had secondary exits through ventilation systems. The Germans controlled the streets, the checkpoints, the papers, and the permits, but they couldn't control what they couldn't see, and they never looked up. The resistance quickly understood the value of what Jakob offered and began expanding his operations with calculated aggression. By April 1941, he wasn't just moving pistols. He carried grenades, ammunition boxes, detonators for explosives, even dismantled rifles that he transported piece by piece over multiple trips. Piotr developed a coding system hidden in Jakob's work schedule. Certain addresses meant certain types of cargo, specific times indicated urgency levels, and the number of chimneys he was scheduled to clean corresponded to the number of weapons components he'd be moving. To any German administrator reviewing his papers, Jakob Mendel was simply a busy tradesman maintaining his business during wartime. The occupiers never questioned why a chimney sweep needed to visit so many addresses in a single day. They never wondered why his routes seemed to zigzag across the city in patterns that made no geographical sense. They saw what they expected to see, a thin man covered in soot, doing unpleasant work that kept their stolen homes comfortable. But the operation's success created a problem Jakob hadn't anticipated: replication. Other resistance cells heard about the chimney sweep smuggler and wanted to use similar tactics. Piotr had to explain again and again why this method couldn't be scaled. It worked because Jakob was real, because he had genuine clients, because his business predated the occupation, and his presence on rooftops raised no suspicion. Sending untrained people onto roofs with weapons would get them killed immediately. The Gestapo wasn't stupid, just unimaginative. The moment they noticed a pattern of non-chimney sweeps climbing buildings, the entire network would collapse. This operation succeeded because it was singular, because Jakob Mendel actually was a chimney sweep who happened to be smuggling weapons, not a smuggler pretending to clean chimneys. The distinction meant everything. And it meant Jakob couldn't stop, couldn't share the burden, couldn't train a replacement. For the next year and a half, the entire vertical supply chain of weapons into central Warsaw would rest on the shoulders of one thin man who'd learned to control his fear somewhere between the rooftops and the sky. The system Jakob and Piotr developed over the spring of 1941 resembled a deadly ballet choreographed across rooftops. Every operation began with reconnaissance disguised as normal business. Jakob would visit a target building days before a weapons transfer, ostensibly to inspect chimneys and provide estimates for cleaning services. During these visits he mapped everything: the location of German personnel, the timing of patrol changes, the sight lines from windows, the structural integrity of roofs, and most critically, the connecting pathways between buildings that only someone with his trained eye could identify. He sketched these details in a notebook, using a code that looked like maintenance records: flue diameter, creosote build-up levels, brick deterioration patterns. To a German inspector, it was the mundane documentation of a tradesman. To Piotr, it was a tactical map showing exactly how weapons could flow through the city's upper levels like water finding cracks in stone. This preparation phase was exhausting and dangerous in its own right, requiring Jakob to maintain cheerful conversations with Nazi officers while simultaneously calculating whether their bedroom chimney could support his weight during a midnight crossing. The actual transfers happened in windows of time so narrow they felt like holding your breath underwater. Jakob learned to read the city's rhythm with supernatural precision. He knew that German patrols changed shifts at 6:45 each morning, creating a 7-minute gap when streets were minimally watched. He understood that officers in requisitioned mansions rarely woke before 8, giving him a golden hour when he could move across their roofs while they slept below. He discovered that the Gestapo headquarters had a blind spot on its eastern side, where the chimney system connected to a neighboring apartment building, an architectural quirk that became a crucial transfer point for weapons moving into the city center. Every variable mattered. Weather conditions affected roof traction, moon phases determined visibility, even the day of the week influenced German alertness levels. Saturdays were best because officers were often nursing hangovers from Friday night celebrations. Mondays were dangerous because fresh troops arrived eager to prove themselves. Jakob absorbed these patterns until they became instinct, until he could feel when a route was safe the way sailors sense approaching storms. The physical demands of the work aged Jakob faster than the calendar suggested. Climbing chimneys is brutal on the body even under normal circumstances, but doing it while carrying concealed weapons, while terrified of discovery, took a toll that compounded daily. His hands developed calluses on top of calluses, his shoulders became permanently knotted with tension, and his knees began to protest every descent into a flue. He lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, dropping from 135 pounds to 118 by the summer of 1941. Elżbieta noticed, but couldn't ask questions, because Jakob had never told her about his arrangement with the resistance. She believed her husband was simply working harder to maintain the business during difficult times. The deception ate at him, but Piotr had been clear. The fewer people who knew, the safer everyone remained. So Jakob carried two secrets through the chimneys: the weapons themselves and the truth about what he was risking every time he climbed onto a roof. The weight of both grew heavier with each passing week. The resistance couldn't pay him, but they supported his cover in ways that proved equally valuable. Piotr arranged for Jakob's business to receive referrals from underground networks, ensuring he maintained a steady stream of legitimate clients that justified his constant movement around the city. Resistance members with connections would recommend Jakob to their German occupiers, praising his efficiency and discretion. This created a perverse situation where Nazi officers actively helped Jakob maintain the very cover he used to arm their enemies. A Wehrmacht captain would tell a Gestapo administrator about the excellent chimney sweep who'd fixed his fireplace, never knowing that Jakob had used that same visit to deposit 3 handguns in a resistance safe house 2 buildings away. The irony would have been funny if the stakes weren't so absolutely lethal. Every recommendation, every positive word from a German officer brought Jakob more access, more credibility, more opportunities to move weapons through the networks of brick and mortar that connected occupied Warsaw in ways its conquerors never imagined. By autumn of 1941, Jakob had moved over 200 weapons components through the rooftop network without a single interception. The success created dangerous confidence within the resistance leadership. Some members began proposing increasingly ambitious operations, using Jakob to smuggle explosives into German administrative buildings, having him plant listening devices in officer quarters, even suggesting he could assassinate high-value targets by dropping grenades down chimneys during Nazi meetings. Piotr rejected these ideas with the firmness of someone who understood that mission creep kills operations. Jakob was valuable precisely because he remained what he appeared to be, a chimney sweep who occasionally carried contraband, not a saboteur using chimney sweeping as a front. The moment his activities expanded beyond weapons smuggling, the moment he did anything that chimney sweeps don't normally do, the entire operation would become visible to German counterintelligence. Piotr's insistence on restraint probably saved Jakob's life a dozen times over, though neither man would ever know which close calls they avoided by maintaining discipline. The temptation to do more, to strike harder, to take revenge for every atrocity whispered through the resistance networks like a seductive poison. But Piotr kept Jakob focused on the mission that only he could accomplish, keeping weapons flowing through the one supply line the Germans didn't know existed. Winter of 1941 brought challenges that nearly ended Jakob's operation before it could prove its full value. Warsaw's rooftops, already treacherous in fair weather, became death traps coated with ice and snow. Chimneys that provided reliable handholds in summer became slick surfaces where a single misstep meant a 4-story fall onto cobblestones. The cold itself was an enemy. Jakob's fingers would go numb inside his gloves, making the delicate work of handling weapons while maintaining balance almost impossible. German patrols increased because the resistance had grown bolder with the weapons Jakob smuggled, creating a vicious cycle where his success made his work more dangerous. But the winter also provided unexpected advantages. Smoke from thousands of chimneys created a haze that reduced visibility across rooftops. The early darkness meant Jakob could make transfers at 4 in the afternoon that would have required midnight runs in summer. And the Germans, like all occupying forces, grew complacent in their comfort. Officers stayed indoors, patrols shortened their routes, and the assumption that nobody would be crazy enough to climb ice-covered roofs in sub-zero temperatures became Jakob's greatest protection. He was crazy enough because the alternative was watching his country disappear one arrested resistance fighter at a time. The closest Jakob came to discovery happened on January 14, 1942, during what should have been a routine transfer. He was crossing between two buildings in the Muranov district, carrying a canvas bag containing 4 disassembled Błyskawica submachine gun components, when a section of ice-covered roof tile gave way beneath his feet. The sound of breaking terracotta echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. Jakob caught himself on a chimney edge, the bag swinging wildly from his shoulder, his boots scrambling for purchase on the angled roof. Below, in the courtyard, a German patrol had been conducting a random identity check. The sound brought their eyes upward instantly. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, Jakob hung frozen against the chimney, clearly visible in his dark work clothes against the snow-covered roof. One of the soldiers raised his rifle. Jakob's mind raced through possibilities. He could drop the weapons bag and claim he'd been doing emergency repairs, but the sound of metal hitting the courtyard would damn him. He could run, but there was nowhere to go. Instead, he did the only thing that might work. He waved cheerfully and called down in broken German, explaining he was checking for ice dams that could damage the flue system. The soldier lowered his rifle slowly, consulted with his sergeant, and then barked up an order, "Finish quickly and get down." They watched him for another minute before resuming their patrol, apparently deciding that a chimney sweep stupid enough to work in these conditions wasn't worth further investigation. That near miss forced Jakob and Piotr to implement new protocols that treated winter operations with the respect they deserved. Transfers during ice or heavy snow were postponed, unless absolutely critical. Jakob began carrying a small hammer and chisel, legitimate tools that also allowed him to create handholds in ice-covered surfaces. He developed new routes that prioritized buildings with better maintenance, avoiding structures where neglect had made roofs unstable. The resistance provided him with better boots, gloves lined with rabbit fur that kept his fingers functional in freezing temperatures, and a canvas coat treated with wax that repelled snow without looking military. These improvements came at a cost. 3 resistance members were caught and executed while trying to procure the materials Jakob needed. Their sacrifice weighed on him during every crossing, a reminder that his survival depended on a network of people who took risks they'd never personally benefit from. He never knew their names, only that they died so he could keep climbing. The spring thaw of 1942 brought a surge in operations that pushed Jakob to his absolute limits. The resistance had grown dramatically over the winter, fueled by increasing German brutality and the weapons Jakob had been steadily supplying. Piotr's network now included 17 different cells operating across Warsaw, and nearly all of them depended on the chimney sweep supply line for armaments. Jakob's schedule became punishing. 6 to 8 transfers per week, each requiring hours of preparation, physical exertion that left him trembling with exhaustion, and the constant psychological strain of knowing that a single mistake would end not just his life, but potentially the entire operation. He was moving weapons components almost daily, sometimes making multiple crossings in a single morning when different cells needed supplies simultaneously. His legitimate chimney-sweeping business began to suffer because he had no energy left for actual clients. Elżbieta noticed his deterioration, the weight loss, the tremors in his hands, the way he jolted awake at night. She begged him to slow down, to let some contracts go, to prioritize his health. Jakob couldn't explain that slowing down meant Polish resistance fighters would face German machine guns with empty rifles, so he simply promised to rest soon, knowing it was a lie they both recognized but neither acknowledged. The psychological toll proved harder to manage than the physical demands. Jakob began having nightmares about falling, about German hands pulling him from chimneys, about his daughter Anna finding his body broken on cobblestones. During the day, paranoia crept into every interaction. When a client mentioned seeing him on a roof the previous week, Jakob's heart would race until he confirmed it was a building where he'd actually been scheduled to work. When German patrols looked at him too long, he fought the urge to run. When resistance contacts were late to meetings, he assumed they'd been arrested and compromised the entire network. Piotr noticed the deterioration and ordered Jakob to take a week off in April, but Jakob refused. He'd done the math. The resistance was planning a major operation for summer, something that would require more weapons than they'd ever moved before. Every week of rest meant fewer weapons in place when the operation launched. So Jakob kept climbing, kept crossing, kept descending into chimneys with bags full of contraband, because someone had to do it, and he was the only one who could. The war had transformed him from a tradesman into a weapon delivery system, and weapons don't get to rest until the war ends. Summer of 1942 marked the period when Jakob's operation reached its most dangerous efficiency. The major action Piotr had hinted at was revealed in June. The resistance was planning coordinated strikes against German supply lines, railroad infrastructure, and administrative targets across Warsaw. The operation required moving nearly 300 weapons components into strategic positions throughout the city within a 6-week window. Jakob would need to make transfers almost daily, sometimes twice daily, through the hottest months when rooftops became furnaces, and his dark clothing made him visible against bright summer skies. The scale was unprecedented and terrifying. Piotr laid out the numbers in a safe house meeting that Jakob attended with growing dread. 57 separate transfers across 23 different routes, involving weapons caches that would need to remain hidden in chimneys, attics, and roof spaces until the coordinated strikes began. Failure wasn't just personal anymore. Hundreds of resistance fighters were depending on these weapons reaching their destinations. The pressure transformed every climb into a high-wire act where the safety net had been removed, and the entire Polish underground watched from below. The Gestapo wasn't blind to the increased resistance activity, and their response made Jakob's work exponentially more dangerous. Counterintelligence units began systematic searches of buildings near sites where resistance operations had occurred. They instituted random roof inspections, sending patrols into attics and onto upper levels of structures that had previously been ignored. Informant networks expanded, with collaborators paid to report unusual activity, including chimney sweeps who visited buildings outside their normal routes. Jakob had to become even more careful about maintaining his cover, ensuring every transfer could be justified as legitimate business if questioned. He started carrying actual chimney cleaning supplies on every operation, performing real work before and after weapons transfers, so that soot and creosote on his clothes matched his stated purpose. On 3 separate occasions, German inspectors stopped him mid-operation, checked his papers, and watched him work to verify he was actually cleaning chimneys. Each time, Jakob's hands remained steady, while his heart tried to break through his ribcage. The hidden weapons in his bag less than 3 feet from German eyes that never thought to look closely at a workman's tools. The heat of summer created physical challenges that rivaled the winter ice. Rooftop temperatures in July reached levels that made metal chimney caps untouchable with bare hands. Jakob developed burns on his palms from equipment that had been baking in direct sunlight. Dehydration became a constant threat during crossings that required him to remain on exposed roofs for extended periods. The canvas bag he used to carry weapons components would be soaked with sweat by the end of each transfer, requiring careful drying to prevent moisture from damaging ammunition. He lost more weight, his already lean frame becoming skeletal, his face developing the hollow-eyed look of someone running on willpower and black market coffee. Elżbieta finally confronted him in August, demanding to know what was destroying her husband. Jakob broke his silence partially, admitting he was doing work for the resistance but refusing to provide details. The revelation terrified her, but she'd suspected something for months. Her only request was that he promise to come home to Anna, to not become another name on the execution lists posted in public squares. Jakob made that promise, knowing it might be a lie. But some lies are merciful when the truth offers no comfort. By late August, Jakob had successfully positioned 247 weapons components across Warsaw's rooftop network. The caches were hidden in places only he could access: false chimney backs, attic spaces behind sealed walls, roof maintenance boxes that appeared empty to casual inspection. Each location was marked in his coded notebook with chimney measurements that only Piotr could decipher. The resistance cells received their instructions. When the operation launched, specific chimney sweeps, all resistance members trained by Jakob in basic climbing, would retrieve weapons from designated locations. It was the closest Jakob had come to sharing his burden, though the actual transfer work remained his alone. The plan was elegant and terrifying. When the coordinated strikes began, weapons would appear from above, from the one direction the Germans had never properly defended. Resistance fighters would descend from rooftops armed with rifles that had traveled through chimneys, a poetic reversal of the usual ground-level warfare that defined urban combat. The operation launched on September 8, 1942, and the results exceeded every expectation while confirming every fear. Across 12 locations simultaneously, resistance fighters struck German positions with weapons that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Railway depots exploded, supply convoys were ambushed, administrative buildings came under coordinated fire. The Germans, caught completely off guard by the scale and coordination, responded with overwhelming force. They instituted martial law, executed suspected resistance members in public squares, and began systematic building-by-building searches that turned Warsaw into a hunting ground. For Jakob, the success meant his smuggling operation was now visible through its effects. The Gestapo knew weapons had been pre-positioned, but couldn't understand how the logistics had worked. Counterintelligence units began investigating every possible supply chain: sewers, underground tunnels, false bottom delivery trucks, diplomatic pouches, smuggling through the Jewish ghetto. They made lists of every tradesman with access to multiple buildings: plumbers, electricians, delivery men, maintenance workers. Chimney sweeps appeared on those lists, but buried deep because the idea seemed absurd. Still, Jakob knew his protection was eroding. The operation that had validated his 2 years of risk had also made him visible in ways that no amount of legitimate cover could fully obscure. The question was no longer whether the Gestapo would eventually connect the pattern, but whether Jakob could stay invisible long enough for it not to matter. The aftermath of the September strikes transformed Warsaw into a city at war with itself. German reprisals were immediate and savage. For every German soldier killed in the coordinated attacks, 10 Polish civilians were executed in public squares. The Gestapo arrested thousands in sweeping raids that targeted anyone with even tangential connections to resistance networks. Piotr's organization lost 17 members in the first week alone, including 3 who knew about Jakob's rooftop operation. Each arrest created a ticking clock. How long before someone broke under torture and revealed the chimney sweep smuggler? Jakob waited for the knock on his door that never came, which meant either the arrested members had died without talking, or the Gestapo hadn't yet made the connection between scattered testimonies about weapons appearing from above. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. Every morning when Jakob left for work, he kissed Anna goodbye, wondering if it was the last time. Every evening when he returned home safely, Elżbieta's relief was visible in the way her shoulders finally relaxed. They were living day to day now, moment to moment, waiting for the inevitable while pretending normalcy was still possible. The Gestapo's intensified security measures made continued operations nearly suicidal, but the resistance needed Jakob more than ever. The September strikes had depleted weapons stockpiles faster than anyone anticipated, and with German forces now on high alert, traditional smuggling routes had become completely unusable. Jakob was the only supply line still functioning, which meant stopping wasn't an option, even as the danger multiplied exponentially. Piotr implemented new protocols designed to protect Jakob at all costs. Transfers were reduced to 1 per week, only for critical operations. Routes were never used twice in succession. Dead drops replaced hand-to-hand exchanges, with Jakob leaving weapons in chimney caches that resistance members retrieved hours later, eliminating direct contact. The changes helped, but they couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem. The Gestapo was now actively looking for patterns in rooftop access, and Jakob's legitimate business created exactly the kind of pattern that counterintelligence units were trained to spot. He was a man who climbed onto buildings across the entire city on a schedule that, if examined closely enough, would reveal too many coincidences, near resistance activity. October brought the break Jakob had been dreading. A Gestapo raid on a safe house in Jolibors uncovered a weapons cache hidden in a chimney, exactly where Jakob had placed it 3 weeks earlier. The discovery itself wasn't catastrophic. The resistance members had already retrieved most of the weapons, leaving only a single disassembled rifle that could have been hidden by anyone. But it confirmed what German counterintelligence had begun to suspect. Chimneys weren't just architectural features, they were part of a smuggling infrastructure. Within 48 hours, new orders circulated through German command. All chimney sweeps in Warsaw were to be questioned about their client lists, their routes, their schedules. Jakob received the summons on October 23rd, report to Gestapo headquarters at Sucha Avenue for routine questioning regarding his business activities. The letter was polite, almost apologetic in its bureaucratic language, but Jakob understood exactly what it meant. They didn't have evidence yet, but they had suspicion, and in occupied Warsaw, suspicion was often enough. Piotr's response to the summons was immediate and unambiguous. Jakob needed to disappear. The resistance would provide false papers, a new identity, transport to the countryside where he could wait out the war in relative safety. His family would follow within days through separate channels to avoid suspicion. It was the smart move, the only move that guaranteed survival. But Jakob refused, and his reasoning revealed how completely the operation had consumed his sense of self. He'd memorized the locations of 47 active weapons caches hidden across Warsaw's rooftop network, supplies that resistance cells were depending on for operations planned through the winter. If he disappeared, that knowledge disappeared with him. The resistance would lose access to weapons they desperately needed, and the Gestapo would know their suspicions were correct, leading to systematic chimney inspections that would uncover every cache. Jakob's proposal was different and infinitely more dangerous. He would attend the questioning, answer truthfully about his legitimate business, and use the interrogation itself to gauge exactly how much the Germans knew. If they had real evidence, he'd recognize it in their questions. If they were fishing, he could maintain his cover and continue operating with even greater caution. It was a gamble that required Jakob to walk voluntarily into Gestapo headquarters and bet his life on his ability to lie convincingly to professional interrogators. The morning of October 27, 1942, Jakob Mendel cleaned his best clothes, kissed his wife and daughter with a calmness he didn't feel, and walked through the gates of the most feared building in occupied Poland. The headquarters at Sucha Avenue was where resistance members disappeared into basement cells and emerged as broken bodies or not at all. Jakob had smuggled weapons within 2 blocks of this building on 6 separate occasions, operating above the heads of the very men who would now question him face to face. The irony would have been amusing in a different life. He was led to a 3rd-floor office where a Gestapo officer named Hauptsturmführer Werner Keller waited with a folder containing Jakob's business records, tax filings, and movement permits. The questioning lasted 4 hours. Keller asked about specific addresses, timing of visits, clients who'd hired Jakob for services near sites of resistance activity. Every question was a potential trap, every answer a chance to contradict himself or reveal knowledge a simple chimney sweep shouldn't possess. Jakob answered with the patient detail of a man who had nothing to hide, explaining the technical requirements of chimney maintenance, the seasonal patterns of his work, the referral networks that generated his client base. He was boring, technical, and completely consistent. And somewhere during hour 3, he saw it, a flicker of frustration in Keller's eyes. The Gestapo had suspicion but no evidence, questions but no answers. When Jakob was finally dismissed with a warning to report any unusual requests from clients, he walked out of Sucha Avenue, knowing he'd won a battle, but not the war. The Gestapo would keep watching, keep questioning, keep building their case. The only question was whether Jakob could finish his work before they finished building it. The Gestapo interrogation changed everything about how Jakob operated, transforming him from a confident smuggler into a man moving through a city that had become a surveillance grid with him at its center. He noticed the watchers immediately. A man reading a newspaper across from his apartment, who appeared 3 mornings in a row, a black sedan that seemed to materialize on streets where Jakob worked, neighbors who asked too many casual questions about his schedule. The surveillance was inconsistent, which meant the Gestapo didn't have unlimited resources to dedicate to one chimney sweep. But it was persistent enough to make weapons transfers nearly impossible. Every route Jakob had developed over 2 years now had to be evaluated through a new lens. Could he access it while being watched without revealing what he was actually doing? Most routes failed this test. The building-to-building crossings that had been his signature technique became too dangerous. because observers on the street could track his movements across rooftops. Jakob was being slowly strangled by visibility, watching his operation die not from discovery, but from the simple fact that he could no longer operate unseen. Piotr proposed shutting down the smuggling operation entirely until the surveillance lifted, but Jakob understood something his resistance contact didn't. The surveillance would never fully lift. The Gestapo had limited resources, but infinite patience. They would watch him intermittently for months, maybe years, waiting for the moment he made a mistake. Meanwhile, the resistance was planning its most ambitious operation yet, a coordinated uprising timed for spring of 1943, when Soviet forces were expected to reach Poland's eastern borders. The operation required weapons positioned throughout the city in quantities that dwarfed everything Jakob had smuggled previously. Piotr needed Jakob to move 400 weapons components into strategic locations over the next 5 months. It was an impossible request given the surveillance, but Jakob had spent 2 years doing impossible things. He proposed a solution that was either brilliant or insane. Instead of avoiding the watchers, he would use them. He would perform such obvious, documented, legitimate chimney-sweeping work that the Gestapo would become bored watching him do exactly what his papers said he did. He would bore them into complacency, and then in the brief windows when surveillance lapsed, he would move weapons with the speed and efficiency of someone who'd been training for exactly this scenario. The strategy required Jakob to become the most fastidious chimney sweep in Warsaw's history. He began documenting every job with obsessive detail. Photographs of chimneys before and after cleaning, written reports to clients describing work performed, receipts that accounted for every zloty earned. He took jobs he didn't need, cleaning chimneys in buildings nowhere near resistance safe houses, establishing patterns of legitimate activity that filled his schedule so completely that the Gestapo watchers saw a man working himself to exhaustion for ordinary business reasons. He deliberately performed mediocre work on some jobs and returned days later to fix his own mistakes, creating plausible reasons to visit the same buildings multiple times. He joined the Warsaw Chimney Sweeps Guild, attending meetings where he complained about wartime supply shortages and German clients who demanded perfection but paid slowly. He became aggressively, performatively normal, a man so committed to his mundane profession that the idea he was also Warsaw's most effective weapons smuggler seemed absurd. And slowly, over November and December of 1942, the surveillance became sporadic. The watchers still appeared, but not every day. The black sedan still followed him, but not on every route. The Gestapo was losing interest because Jakob Mendel had become exactly what his papers claimed: boring. The moment surveillance became inconsistent, Jakob struck with precision that made his previous operations look cautious. He identified a 3-day window in late December when the watchers seemed to have disappeared entirely, likely reassigned to more promising targets during the Christmas period when German forces relaxed their guard. In those 72 hours, Jakob moved 43 weapons components across 11 different routes, working virtually non-stop from dawn until well past curfew, using his essential worker papers to justify movement during restricted hours. He climbed chimneys in snowstorms that reduced visibility to almost zero, crossed ice-covered roofs he'd previously deemed too dangerous, and descended into flues with weapons bags so heavy they threatened to pull him off balance. The physical toll was catastrophic. He tore muscles in his shoulder during one crossing, developed frostbite on 3 fingers when his gloves failed during a midnight transfer, and nearly passed out from exhaustion while descending a chimney in Śródmieście. But when those 3 days ended, nearly a tenth of the resistance's required weapons were positioned exactly where they needed to be. Piotr was stunned by the output, but also terrified by what it revealed about Jakob's state of mind. The chimney sweep had stopped calculating acceptable risk and started treating his own survival as secondary to mission completion. January of 1943 brought news that changed the entire equation. The Soviet advance had stalled hundreds of kilometers east of Poland, meaning the planned spring uprising would need to be delayed indefinitely or launched without the external support the resistance had been counting on. For Jakob, this meant the 5-month timeline he'd been killing himself to meet had suddenly become meaningless. The weapons he was positioning might sit in their chimney caches for months, maybe years, before being used. Piotr gave him permission to slow down, to prioritize his safety over speed, to let his battered body recover. But Jakob couldn't stop, because stopping meant confronting what he'd become. He was no longer Jakob Mendel, the chimney sweep who sometimes smuggled weapons. He was a weapon delivery system who sometimes swept chimneys to maintain cover. The operation had consumed his identity so completely that removing it would leave nothing behind. So he kept climbing, kept crossing, kept descending into darkness with bags full of contraband, because the alternative was acknowledging that he'd sacrificed his health, his marriage, his relationship with his daughter, and nearly his sanity for an operation that might never achieve its intended purpose. The war had transformed him into something singular and broken, and there was no going back to the man he'd been before Piotr had asked that first terrible question. Would you use your chimneys to move weapons? February of 1943 delivered the crisis that Jakob's deteriorating body and mind could no longer withstand. During a routine transfer in the Ochota district, his exhaustion finally betrayed him in the worst possible way. He was crossing between two buildings, carrying a bag containing 6 pistol components, when his vision blurred and his legs simply gave out. He collapsed onto a snow-covered roof, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs, the weapons bag sliding dangerously close to the roof edge. For several minutes Jacob lay there unable to move, his heart racing irregularly, his breathing shallow and rapid. This wasn't fatigue or cold or fear. This was his body shutting down, refusing to continue the punishment he'd been inflicting on it for over 2 years. He eventually managed to crawl to a chimney, complete the transfer through sheer force of will, and descend to street level. But the message was clear. He was operating on borrowed time and the debt was coming due. When he reached home that evening, Elżbieta took one look at him and called for a doctor. A dangerous move in occupied Warsaw, but one she deemed necessary. The doctor, a resistance sympathizer who asked no questions, delivered a diagnosis that was both expected and devastating: severe malnutrition, chronic exhaustion, and signs of early heart failure. Jakob needed rest measured in months, not days, or his next collapse would likely be his last. Piotr's response to the medical report was to immediately suspend all of Jakob's operations and assign him to pure administrative work, managing the coded notebooks that tracked weapons cache locations, training potential backup smugglers in basic rooftop navigation, consulting on route planning from the safety of resistance safe houses. It was the rational decision, the humane decision, and Jakob hated every second of it. Sitting in safe houses while other resistance members risked their lives felt like betrayal, even though his 2 years of work had earned him the right to step back. The backup smugglers Piotr recruited were younger, stronger, and more physically capable than Jakob in his current state, but they lacked his intimate knowledge of Warsaw's rooftop geography. They could follow routes Jakob had mapped, but they couldn't improvise when situations changed, couldn't read the architectural language that revealed hidden pathways, couldn't sense when a roof was about to give way before it actually did. 2 of the backup smugglers were caught within weeks, not because of Gestapo brilliance, but because they made mistakes Jakob would have instinctively avoided. Their executions were public, their bodies displayed in Piłsudski Square as warnings. Jakob attended the aftermath, staring at men who'd died trying to do his job, and the guilt nearly broke him. March brought an unexpected development that pulled Jakob back into active operations despite his failing health: the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Jewish resistance fighters, facing systematic extermination, launched a desperate armed rebellion against impossible odds. The Polish resistance, which had been stockpiling weapons for their own planned uprising, faced an agonizing decision: divert resources to support the ghetto fighters, knowing it would deplete supplies needed for future operations, or maintain their strategic reserves while other Poles died fighting the same enemy. Piotr's network chose solidarity. They would move weapons into the ghetto through any means possible, and the only means that had any chance of success was Jakob's chimney network. The ghetto walls were heavily guarded, making street-level smuggling suicidal, but the walls didn't extend above the roofline. Buildings on the ghetto's edge had chimney systems that connected to structures inside the sealed district. Jakob, weakened and barely recovered, was the only person who knew which chimneys could serve as transfer points. Piotr didn't order him back into action, couldn't order him given his medical condition, but simply presented the facts. Jewish fighters were dying with empty rifles, while weapons sat in caches Jakob had positioned. The decision was Jakob's alone. Jakob's return to the rooftops in late April 1943 was a shadow of his previous operations. He could only manage one crossing per day, needed frequent rests, and required assistance from resistance spotters who helped haul weapons bags to rooftops before he made the actual transfers. But the routes he opened into the ghetto proved invaluable, allowing resistance fighters to smuggle approximately 80 weapons components through chimney networks over a 3-week period. The transfers were agonizing. Jakob would climb onto a building on the Aryan side, cross to a structure whose chimney system connected to the ghetto, and lower weapons down flues that opened into rooms where Jewish fighters waited in darkness. He never saw the people who received the weapons, never knew their names, only that somewhere in the burning ghetto, Polish-made pistols and rifles were being used to fight back against extermination. The physical cost was severe. Jakob's heart condition worsened. His weight dropped to barely 100 pounds and he developed a persistent cough that Elżbieta feared was tuberculosis. But he continued until May 8th, when the ghetto uprising was finally crushed and there was nowhere left to send weapons. The aftermath of the ghetto's fall marked the true end of Jakob's active smuggling career. He'd given everything he had, pushed his body past every reasonable limit, and accomplished what no one thought possible, maintaining a weapons supply line for over 2 years while operating under the noses of an occupying army. But the cost had aged him decades. At 36, he looked 60. His hands trembled constantly. Walking up a single flight of stairs left him breathless. The Gestapo surveillance had ended not because they'd cleared him of suspicion, but because he so obviously posed no physical threat to anyone. Piotr arranged for Jakob and his family to be evacuated to the countryside in June 1943. A reward and a retirement, a recognition that the chimney sweep smuggler had earned his survival. Before leaving Warsaw, Jakob made one final climb. He ascended to the rooftop of his own apartment building, looked out over the city he'd spent 2 years navigating from above, and tried to calculate whether the cost had been worth it. The answer wasn't simple. He'd moved approximately 630 weapons components through the chimney network, supplies that had enabled dozens of resistance operations, killed German soldiers, and prolonged the fight for Polish independence. But he'd also destroyed his health, traumatized his family, and watched men die trying to replicate what he'd done. The balance sheet of war rarely resolves into clear moral victories. Only the messy arithmetic of sacrifice measured against outcomes that won't be known for years. The countryside safe house where Jakob's family lived from June 1943 until the war's end was a small farmhouse 30 kilometers southeast of Warsaw, hidden among fields that had fed the capital for generations. The transition from active operations to forced retirement was brutal for Jakob in ways he hadn't anticipated. His body began the slow process of recovery. He gained weight, his hands stopped trembling quite so severely, and the irregular heartbeat that had terrified Elżbieta gradually stabilized with rest and adequate food. But his mind remained on Warsaw's rooftops, replaying every crossing, second-guessing decisions made in split seconds, wondering which weapons caches had been discovered and which remained hidden in chimneys, waiting for operations that might never come. He had nightmares where he fell endlessly through darkness, or climbed chimneys that stretched infinitely upward, or descended into flues filled with the bodies of the backup smugglers who died trying to continue his work. Elżbieta watched her husband slowly return from wherever the war had taken him, but she knew the man who came back wasn't quite the same one who'd left. War doesn't just take bodies. It takes pieces of identity that can never be fully recovered. News from Warsaw reached the safe house in fragments, carried by resistance couriers who moved between the countryside and the occupied city. Jakob learned that the major uprising he'd been preparing for finally launched in August of 1944, 13 months after he'd positioned the last weapons cache. The Warsaw Uprising was a 63-day battle that saw resistance fighters use the weapons Jakob had smuggled to engage German forces in urban warfare that turned the capital into a battlefield. Reports indicated that caches hidden in chimneys across the city had proven crucial during the early days of fighting, providing weapons that appeared exactly where commanders needed them, sometimes from positions the Germans never anticipated. Jakob received this news with emotions he couldn't fully articulate: pride that his work had mattered, grief for the fighters dying with weapons he'd carried, and a complicated guilt that he wasn't there climbing rooftops to resupply positions under fire. Piotr sent a message through the courier network specifically for Jakob. The chimney sweep's contribution to the uprising had saved lives and enabled operations that wouldn't have been possible without his 2 years of work. The message ended with a simple statement: "You did enough." But Jakob wasn't sure he believed it. The war ended for Warsaw in January 1945, when Soviet forces finally liberated the destroyed capital, and for Europe in May, when Germany surrendered unconditionally. Jakob returned to Warsaw in July 1945 to find a city that barely resembled the one he'd left. Over 80% of the buildings had been destroyed, either in the uprising or during the systematic German demolition that followed. The rooftop networks he'd spent 2 years memorizing no longer existed. The chimneys he'd climbed were rubble. The safe houses where he delivered weapons were empty foundations. He tried to find Piotr, but learned his resistance contact had died during the uprising's final days, shot by German snipers, while coordinating the evacuation of wounded fighters. Of the 17 cell leaders Jakob had worked with, only 4 survived the war. The backup smugglers who'd tried to continue his work were all dead. The Jewish resistance fighters he'd supplied through ghetto chimneys were gone, their entire community erased. Jakob stood in the ruins of Warsaw and confronted a truth that veterans of all wars eventually face. Survival doesn't always feel like victory when you're standing among the ghosts of everyone who didn't make it. Rebuilding his life in post-war Warsaw proved almost as difficult as surviving the occupation. The chimney-sweeping business he'd inherited from his father no longer existed because most of the chimneys no longer existed. He found work in reconstruction efforts, using his knowledge of pre-war building structures to help engineers understand what could be salvaged and what needed complete demolition. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 2 years preserving a weapons network hidden in Warsaw's architecture, and now he was helping tear down what remained of that architecture to build something new. He rarely spoke about his wartime activities, not because they were classified, but because the stories felt impossible to explain. How do you tell someone you spent 24 months carrying weapons through chimneys while Germans slept below? How do you convey the specific terror of hanging from a rooftop edge with a bag full of grenades while patrol searchlights swept across the buildings? How do you describe the weight of knowing that men died using weapons you personally delivered to their hands? Jakob discovered that the most profound experiences of war often become he most private, locked away in memories that can't be adequately translated into peacetime language. The recognition Jakob eventually received came decades late and from unexpected sources. In 1978, a historian researching the Warsaw Uprising discovered coded references to a chimney sweep smuggler in resistance documents that had survived the war. The historian tracked down Jakob, by then 71 years old, and living quietly in a small apartment with Elżbieta. The interviews that followed became the first documented account of the rooftop weapons network, a story so unusual that several academic reviewers initially questioned whether it was exaggerated or partially fabricated. But the historian cross-referenced Jakob's testimony with surviving resistance members, German occupation records that mentioned mysterious weapons appearing in unexpected locations, and architectural surveys of pre-war Warsaw that confirmed the chimney connections Jakob described. The resulting published account, released in 1981, finally gave Jakob's contribution the historical recognition it deserved. He was awarded medals by the Polish government, invited to speak at commemorations, and interviewed by journalists who seemed almost disappointed that the legendary chimney sweep smuggler was just a quiet old man who still had nightmares about falling. Jakob accepted the recognition with grace but without enthusiasm, because the honors belonged equally to the backup smugglers who'd died, the resistance members who'd trusted him with their lives, and Piotr, who'd first seen the potential in a thin man who climbed buildings for a living. The medals felt heavy not with achievement, but with the accumulated weight of everyone who should have been standing beside him to receive them. Jacob Mendel died in 1992 at the age of 85, outliving most of his generation and nearly all of his wartime contemporaries. His funeral was attended by historians, veterans, and a handful of elderly resistance survivors who remembered the chimney sweep who'd moved like a ghost above occupied Warsaw. But perhaps the most meaningful presence was Anna, his daughter, who'd been 7 years old when her father started his secret war and who'd spent her entire adult life trying to understand the man who'd come home from the countryside in 1945, changed in ways she couldn't articulate as a child. In her eulogy, she spoke about the nightmares her father never stopped having, the way he'd flinch at loud noises decades after the war ended, and the profound sadness that lived behind his eyes even during moments of happiness. She also spoke about his insistence that what he'd done wasn't heroism, but simply the minimum required of anyone who watched evil unfold and possessed the ability to resist. Jacob had told her repeatedly in his final years that he didn't climb those rooftops to become a hero. He climbed them because the alternative was living with the knowledge that he could have acted and chose comfort instead. That distinction mattered to him until the very end. The historical significance of Jacob's operation extends far beyond the 630 weapons he personally smuggled. Military historians now recognize his rooftop network as one of the most innovative logistics solutions developed by any resistance movement during the Second World War. The German occupation of Warsaw was comprehensive and brutal, employing surveillance techniques and security measures that made conventional smuggling nearly impossible. Jacob succeeded where others failed because he operated in a dimension the occupiers literally couldn't see. His story challenges our assumptions about what resistance looks like. Not always armed battalions or dramatic sabotage, but sometimes a thin man with a rope and brush exploiting the architectural gaps in a totalitarian security system. The broader lesson is uncomfortable for military planners even today. The most sophisticated occupation can still be defeated by someone who understands the occupied territory better than the occupiers, someone willing to risk everything by exploiting advantages so mundane they're invisible until they're not. But beyond the tactical innovations and historical footnotes, Jacob's story forces us to confront questions that can't be resolved with comfortable distance. What do we owe each other when civilization collapses? Jacob was a tradesman with a family, someone who could have reasonably claimed he had responsibilities that justified inaction. He could have swept chimneys for German officers, collected his payments and survived the war without ever putting a weapon in resistance hands. Thousands of Poles made exactly that choice, and history doesn't judge them as harshly as we might imagine because survival under occupation is its own form of resistance. But Jacob saw a different calculation. The weapons he didn't move meant resistance fighters facing machine guns with empty rifles, meant operations cancelled for lack of supplies, meant the slow extermination of his people proceeding without armed opposition. He chose to act knowing it would probably kill him, and in a very real sense it did. The man who climbed down from those rooftops in 1943 was physically alive but existentially damaged in ways that never fully healed. Was the trade worth it? Jacob spent 49 years after the war asking himself that question, and the answer apparently remained complicated enough that he never stopped asking. Here's what should make Jacob's story resonate across the decades, separating us from occupied Warsaw. The moral architecture of his choice still exists in our world. Every day, people encounter situations where they possess unique abilities to resist injustice, prevent harm, or support those facing oppression. The cost of action is always calculable: risk to career, family, safety, comfort. The cost of inaction is harder to measure because it accumulates in the lives we don't save, the resistance we don't support, the evil we allow to proceed because intervening would be inconvenient or dangerous. Jacob Mendel wasn't born courageous. He was born with the ability to climb chimneys, and when circumstances demanded it, he transformed a mundane skill into a weapon against occupation. The uncomfortable implication is that most of us possess similar latent capabilities, skills and access and knowledge that could be leveraged for purposes beyond personal advancement. We just rarely face the moment when history demands we make Jacob's choice. sacrifice yourself to resist, or preserve yourself while others suffer. And if we're honest, most of us hope we never face that moment, because Jacob's example suggests that choosing correctly might cost everything we have. So let me ask you directly, because Jacob's story demands engagement, not passive observation. If you possessed a skill that could save lives but would almost certainly destroy your own in the process, what would you do? Not what you'd like to believe you'd do. Not the heroic version you tell yourself in comfortable moments, but what you'd actually do when your daughter is 7 years old and Gestapo interrogators are making lists and every morn. Ing might be your last. Jacob chose to climb, and it gave resistance fighters the tools to fight back while costing him his health, his peace, and decades of nightmares he couldn't escape. History records his choice as heroic, but heroism is just the word we use to describe unbearable sacrifice when it achieves something we value. The next question is harder. Was Jacob right? Did those 630 weapons justify what they cost him and his family? The historian in me wants to calculate resistance operations enabled versus personal destruction inflicted, but the human in me knows that arithmetic is obscene. Some choices can't be reduced to cost-benefit analysis because they're about who we are when everything else is stripped away. Jacob climbed those chimneys because not climbing meant being someone he couldn't live with, and maybe that's the only answer that matters. The real tragedy isn't that Jacob suffered for his choices. It's that we've built a world where people still have to make variations of his choice, where justice and survival remain in tension, where doing the right thing reliably costs more than most people can afford to pay. Jacob's rooftops are gone, demolished by the war he fought and the peace that followed, but the moral landscape he navigated still exists, waiting for the next person who'll have to decide whether their unique ability to resist creates an obligation to act, or whether survival is justification enough for silence. Jacob chose resistance. The question his life poses to everyone who hears his story is simple and devastating. What would you choose, and could you live with the answer?